Back with our world lead, a CNN team intended to go to Darfur to report on the humanitarian crisis driven by Sudan's bloody 18-month civil war. But that CNN crew was taken captive, held under armed guard for 48 hours before they could reach their intended destination. CNN's chief international correspondent Klarissa Ward, the producer Brent Swales, and cameraman Scott McQuinney are thankfully all safe. And Klarissa joins us now. Klarissa, first of all, I'm so glad you're okay. You and your team sprang at the rare opportunity to report from that region. Tell us about where you were intending to go and what happened.
So, Jake, we were trying to get to a town called Tawila in North Darfur. It is quite close to the besieged city of El Fasher, where some of the heaviest fighting has been taking place in Darfur, also to the Zamzam displacement camp, where a famine was declared in August. And Tawila has been a refuge to hundreds of thousands of people who have poured in because it's in a neutral territory, and it's held by a group called the SLM, the Sudan Liberation Movement. They are a neutral actor. They invited us to come stay with them. We were supposed to meet them in the town of Abu Gamra, and very sadly or unfortunately, they did not turn up. And instead, we were picked up by another militia who were very suspicious of us, who appeared to think we were spies. We were interrogated for many hours, and then they took us essentially with them to spend 48 hours in captivity underneath an acacia tree.
What was that like? What was your time in captivity like? And why did they ultimately, thankfully, decide to release you and your producer and cameraman?
Well, I think we were fortunate in the sense that our captors were pretty kind to us after a few very panic-inducing moments in the beginning. We sat and told them that we were sorry for any offense that we had committed and that we had children and families and please not to hurt us. And they did seem to soften a bit towards us at that point. It was still pretty intense because, of course, it was stressful not being able to talk to our families and worrying that our families were worrying about us and worrying that we didn't know when we would be able to get home. As the only woman, I was concerned about limiting my food and water intake because there was no private space to relieve myself. But after 2 days, they came back, and then suddenly they were all smiles and posing for photographs and telling us we were going to be going home because it had been decided that we weren't spies. And that was a tremendous relief, but also, honestly, Jake, it was still bitterly disappointing because as journalists, we never want to become the story. We are not the story. We are there to shed a light on the real story. And in that respect, we very sadly were not successful on this trip in terms of highlighting the suffering of the people of Darfur.
Well, let's shine that light because the wars in the Middle East and Ukraine have really overshadowed the conflict in Sudan, which many believe is the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world right now. Give us a sense of the scale of the war and also how hard it is for journalists such as yourself to report on it.
So in terms of getting into Darfur, you're literally talking about one or two international journalists who have been able to get into that area. They have only been able to spend short amounts of time there. They have been very limited in terms of what they can show. The two main warring factions don't want journalists on the ground. They don't want people seeing what is happening there. There are vicious war crimes being perpetrated on the ground. Darfur was the site of a genocide from 2003 to 2005, and now there are many people who are warning that the very worst could be realized once again. We went there at the end of rainy season, Jake. That means that the fighting is starting again. The Yale Humanitarian Research Lab, which studies satellite imagery, which frankly is the only reliable data we're really getting from Darfur at the moment, has said that in the first 2 weeks of October alone, the RSF, or Rapid Support Forces, one of the main warring factions, set 14 villages ablaze. So there is very real concern that this man-made famine could spread and that this conflict could continue, and that, as I mentioned before, the very real specter of another genocide taking place in Darfur again, while the world is unaware simply because it is so hard to get reliable data, to get aid organizations, human rights organizations, and journalists on the ground, and to get the stories of the people of Darfur out to the world, Jake.